Max Weems. I'm the principal planner with the City of Pompano Beach, former sustainability coordinator. With us tonight, we have our consultant RSNH. We have Ben Moore and Nathan Stennett. So the state of Florida has funded through the Resilient Florida program what they're calling vulnerability assessments, where they're asking local governments to produce this data and these studies so that they can, on a statewide perspective, have a larger idea of what's going on around the state in terms of particular vulnerabilities to critical assets within our municipalities. So that is a study that we've undertaken here. It is a study of these existing conditions and a few future scenarios. It is not a study where there are solutions identified. So all of this is just a data collection exercise so that we can appropriately plan for expected outcomes in the future, and with a few scenarios not in the future as well. Of course, that'll all be explained by our consultants, so I'm going to, at this point, hand it over. Actually, first I need to say this presentation is being recorded, and it will be live streamed on channel 78 and available on our YouTube channel following the meeting. And a lot of the information tonight, as well as the interactive web tool, will be available on our website. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Ben Moore of RSNH.
As Max mentioned, I'm Ben Moore with RSNH, consultant to the city for this project, and this is an area of consultancy resiliency that we specialize in. I'm very happy to be working on this here in the city. And as Max mentioned tonight, this is all about tonight we're all talking about this vulnerability assessment that we are near completion with for the city. So I'm going to give you guys an introduction to the city's journey to this point, and then Nathan's going to go into all the detail with you guys tonight. So, I'm Ben Moore. Nathan's going to get up and meet you in a second. We won't get into too much about our background or anything like that. I'm sure that's uninteresting to any of you. What I wanted to give a little bit of context to is the city's engagement with sustainability and resilience, because it's been going on for a long time now. So, and we've been working with the city for a long time now. So back in 2018, we worked together to come up with a strategy that would allow the city to, piece by piece, attack these issues of sustainability and resilience. And I think it's been quite successful, because it has allowed the city to attract grant funding for a lot of those steps on this game board here, including the one we're talking about tonight, which was funded by a Resilient Florida grant. So after the strategy, we went ahead and we did a baseline of all the energy use, water use, waste production, greenhouse gas emissions in the city, and developed some goals for improving in those areas. And then from there, and again, that was a grant-funded initiative. And from there, we went forward and developed a portfolio of projects to deal with those issues that we had identified. So how do we reduce energy use? How do we reduce water consumption? And that's important to point out, because right now, what we're going to be talking about tonight is sort of a baseline of where the vulnerabilities are when it comes to flooding in the city. As Max mentioned, the solutions are not yet on the table, but we can follow the model we used in the past and probably find a grant to develop the solutions for the problems that we're talking about tonight. You need to know what the problems are before you can move forward, and that's where we are. So in this yellow area is where we are tonight. We're talking about this vulnerability assessment and adaptation action areas, and then the next step might be an adaptation action plan, which is where you're finding the solutions. And there could be money available from the state of Florida to do that, now that we've gone through this step. And that's what I'm talking about right here. So the Resilient Florida program is a great program that the state has launched, and it is thank you, and it is funding projects like this all over the state, because the state is vulnerable to this issue of flooding, and the problem is getting worse due to sea level rise. So it was signed into law in 2021, and it provides support to cities like Pompano Beach who want to plan their future. And it also provides funding to cities after they've started to plan their future to fund the projects that are necessary to get ahead of this flooding issue. So two things that are important: planning and infrastructure can be funded through this program. The other thing that it really encourages is the development of these adaptation action areas, which we're going to get into in a second, but this is identifying locations within the city where there's a priority on dealing with these issues of flooding. And again, once you have identified this geographic area of priority, it can influence not only the city's planning, but also can help it reach into some sources of money to fund solutions in those areas. So we'll talk about where those adaptation action areas should be set up in Pompano Beach. And again, we're hoping that all of this positions the city to compete for the funding that's available for resilience, and there's a lot of it available right now, a lot of it. So where are we on this specific project? We started off, obviously, a while back collecting data. This is all a very data-intensive process right now to understand where the flood issues are. Collect a lot of that data, did a lot of modeling. We leveraged a lot of the modeling that the city had already done to dive further into this. And there's kind of two pieces to this analysis. One is what we call exposure analysis, and that is what kind of flood risk exists. There's a lot of different ways that the city can flood. And we'll talk about some of those ways that the city can flood in a second. We model those exposure possibilities. And then the next question is, okay, so it floods, what gets affected? And how do those things respond to being flooded? So we looked at a lot of different city assets, neighborhoods, to find out if the waters reach a certain level, what's the effect? What's the consequence? And are there assets that are critical that could get flooded, like a fire station, for example, that if it were to be flooded would really reduce the city's ability to function. So we looked at those. And now we've reached a point where we want to start to get some feedback before we finalize this work. So here we are at this public outreach meeting. And then after tonight, after we get your feedback, we'll be finalizing this work. The city will have a vulnerability assessment. It will put it in position to compete for state funds to act. That's where we are right now. So I'm going to hand it over to Nathan now, my colleague, to talk about all these things that I just highlighted in much more detail. So Nathan, start it up.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate that. Yeah, I've got quite a few slides, and I'm going to try to avoid getting too technical with this stuff, so I'll go through them quickly, but if you have questions, just bring them up as I go along. So this is a forward-looking study. We looked at some scenarios that are just rainfall alone, and they're compound scenarios. So we looked at some that include sea level rise and rainfall, and what would happen if both of those things happened at once. Sea level rise, obviously, we look into the future. And the Resilient Florida program that funded this study requires us to look at the NOAA 2017, 2040 intermediate high and low, and 2070 intermediate high and low sea level curves. So what you see there on the slide is in 2040, there's not a lot of difference between the intermediate high and the intermediate low, and it's less than 1 foot of sea level. But when you get to 2070, there becomes a lot of difference between those curves. And the low curve is kind of assuming that we do more things to reduce emissions and slow the pace of climate change. The high curve is more like a business as usual kind of scenario. We also incorporated into this study looking at extreme rainfall. So that's a predicted effect of climate change, that storms can get more severe. You might have more rain in a shorter period of time. I think we've seen some of that in this region in the past year. We had some unusually intense rainfall events. And so we tried to incorporate that into the study, and this is just showing some rainfall change factors from the South Florida Water Management District. I won't go too much into them, but you can see that the amount of rain is projected to increase for the different types of storms that have different return intervals going forward. We also looked at storm surge in one of the scenarios, and for this we used a storm surge that would be expected to have like a 1% chance of happening in any given year, so like over a 100-year period once. And storm surge is, a pretty dramatic and catastrophic scenario. It's not something that you expect will happen, but it's certainly possible living in Florida with the hurricanes and things that can happen here. So the way that we did the modeling for this study is a little bit different than other flood models or sea level rise models that you may have seen. And we really tried to leverage the work that the city has done in the past. So we took the city's stormwater model, it was developed in a software called SWIM, and that was done back in 2013. And we updated it. And when we updated it, we incorporated these rainfall scenarios and sea level rise and storm surge, and looked at what would happen with the groundwater table in the city if it rises due to sea level rise. So this is really unique, I think, this study, in that it's taking the city's stormwater infrastructure into account. And so we modeled, how the stormwater system would respond to these changes in the different scenarios, and then we took that model, which is basically what they call a one-dimensional model. It's just points on a map, nodes in the stormwater infrastructure meet the surface, and we turned that into a two-dimensional model that is the surface that covers the landscape. So these are our different flood scenarios that we looked at. The first one is a 5-year, 24-hour rainfall event. So what that means is the amount of rainfall you would expect in a 24-hour period that you'd expect to happen every 5 years or so. It would have a 20% chance of happening in any year. Then we looked at that, plus the NOAA 2040 intermediate low and intermediate high sea level increase. Scenarios 2 and 3. And then in scenario 4, we looked at the 2070 intermediate low plus the rainfall and the 2070 intermediate high in scenario 5. And then 6 is just looking at a 100-year, 72-hour rainfall event. So that would be, if you had a 3-day stretch of time, 1% chance rainfall. So a pretty extreme of rain. And the 7th scenario, which is the most severe one, is that 100-year, 72-hour event plus the storm surge. Now I'm going to show you an online map that we developed for this project. And the idea behind the online map is that it's a tool the city can use going forward after we're done and walk away from this project. They'll still have it. And they can go in and use it to make planning decisions. So they can say, we're thinking about building something here or approving a permit here. What is this showing happen in the future with our sea level scenarios? I'm going to try to turn the mic so I can work the computer and still talk. Okay, so this is, I believe, the first scenario, scenario 1. And you can see that the green dots are critical assets that we identified. And those are things like, there's a lot of stormwater infrastructure in there, so a lot of lift stations, things like that. Also things like City Hall and the fire stations, and also some privately owned things that are critical to the function of the city. So medical facilities, nursing homes, the Broward Sheriff's Department offices in there, those sort of things. And what you see under this 5-year, 24-hour storm, the amount of rain that you get in a 24-hour period, the 20% chance of happening in any 1 year, there's really only one of those critical assets that shows up as likely to be flooded. So, and that's out at the beach. I think it's lift station 20. That's showing up in red there. And pretty much everything else should be okay under that scenario. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and just use the time. So this is the third scenario, and that is the rainfall event plus the 2040 high, sea level rise. And you can see there's more flooding, more areas flooded on the map. But there's still just one asset showing up flooded. So that's kind of a good news story, you know, even if you go out over 20 years in the future, you still don't have a big problem at that low, 2040 low sea level rise curve. Okay, now this is scenario 5, I believe. And this is the 2070 intermediate high plus with the rainfall event, the 24-hour rainfall. So here you see, if you look out to 2070, remember when we looked at the sea level rise curves, the high and the low start to make a big difference in 2070. So if we stay on this kind of business as usual emissions profile, you actually could have quite a few of the critical assets getting flooded by 2070. So things that are showing up there in yellow and orange and red would be subject to flooding under that scenario. And then there's one more I want to look at, which is the most severe one. This is the storm surge scenario, scenario 7. So in this scenario, you can see that large amounts of the city are inundated. The flood depths actually are pretty deep, like over 10 feet, and in places. And a lot of assets are going to be affected under that scenario. But again, that's not something that's very likely to happen. But you know, in a 100-year period, it could happen. So are there any questions about the flood scenarios or the modeling that we did or how it was done?
Did you make any assumptions relative to king tide events coinciding with rain events, and what were your elevations of the tidal flood barriers in your modeling?
That's a really good question. I didn't personally do the modeling, but I believe they did include a high tide event in it. I can check on that.
What about the elevations of the tidal flood barriers in areas where we've got sheet flow and the new tidal flood barrier ordinance requiring elevations of +5?
Right.
Did they assume a barrier of +5 surrounding the city?
So this study looked at the stormwater system, and it didn't take those type of barriers into account. It's more about modeling the water moving through the stormwater system than about modeling water flowing above the ground surface.
Right, not just if the tidal flood barriers are constructed to +5 as the ordinance requires, then that has the potential to cause a bathtub effect and overwhelm the storm system.
Yeah, I think it could be an area for more study.
This is a curiosity for me. I understand that you're focused on the city of Pompano Beach and the general surrounding area, but if we're talking about, some of your scenarios are talking about some significant rainfall and storm surge and all the rest of it, how much is being taken into account for what's going to happen to the aquifer and water coming from the Everglades and water coming from Deerfield Beach and those kinds of things?
Yeah. That's a really good question, a good point. I think that Broward County is doing some modeling, at a county scale that would try to account for some of those things. There's a lot of impacts, like salinization is one, when sea level rises and the groundwater table rises, you can get salt coming into freshwater wells and that sort of thing. That's not something we looked at in this study, but it is, something to,
That's something that this
concerned about.
study will probably help inform, maybe? in the
yeah,
future?
it could, yeah. Okay, well, I'm almost done with this, so. All right, I'm going to go back to the slide deck.
Okay, is this better? Is it on? Okay, great. So, we wanted to go beyond just generating these models and look at what would actually happen to the critical assets that we'd identified. And we did that kind of in two phases. So the first phase is exposure. And the way we looked at exposure is, would the parcel that this asset, whether it be a lift station or a school or whatever it is, would that parcel that it sits on be flooded at all? Would it be touched by our flood layer, basically? And when we looked at that, you can see there were 86 critical assets that would be exposed under at least one of the scenarios. So a lot of them, again, weren't really exposed until we got to that extreme storm surge scenario. If you look at, just the rainfall events and the, 20, 40 sea level rise, the numbers that would be exposed are pretty small. So this is all of them. And the other thing is, just because the parcel might be exposed does not necessarily mean that that asset would be affected. So that was the next step, the sensitivity analysis I'll talk about in a second. We also looked at the transportation system. So we looked at major roadways and evacuation routes and looked at the percentage of those roadways by length that would be affected in the city. So the 2070 intermediate high sea level rise curve, that's scenario 5. You see that start to show up with the roadways at 16%. And then scenario 7, over almost 40% of the roadways could be affected. And then we also looked at rail, and rail wasn't really affected except under the storm surge scenario. We also looked at the city's neighborhoods, and so this map is just showing the percentage of the neighborhood that would be exposed to flooding under, this is under the 2070 intermediate high sea level rise plus a 20% chance rainfall event. So you can see those neighborhoods that are showing up there as being affected. And then this is a similar map for neighborhoods looking at the 100-year, 72-hour storm plus the storm surge. So this is the most severe scenario, and quite a few neighborhoods would be affected. Mostly in the east and the southern part of the city. Something else we wanted to look at was socioeconomic vulnerability. So as kind of a proxy for that, it's a very involved area. We use these Justice 40 tracts, and so they are disadvantaged communities. They're based on census tracts that the federal government has determined to have one or more of these different socioeconomic or environmental or climate burdens. So the list of them there. And one reason we wanted to look at Justice 40 is because these communities are advantaged when it comes to getting federal grant funding. There's a lot of money that's come out in the last few years for climate change and resilience and adaptation. And so being able to talk about those disadvantaged tracts and how they are affected under these issues could possibly help get some money to do projects in those areas. So just a little more on the critical assets. I talked a little bit about this already, but the process we went through, we developed a critical asset list in collaboration with the city. We mapped them, we analyzed them for flood exposure under our scenarios, and then we looked at sensitivity. So what we did to look at sensitivity, the ones that showed up as exposed, we actually went on Google Earth and looked at them on Google Earth and Google Street View to see what asset, what facilities actually on that parcel? And do we think that would actually be flooded? Because just because there's, a little corner of the parcel really doesn't mean that facility would be. And then we also talked to the city about what some of those assets were and how vulnerable that they felt they were. So our next step will be to come up with some initial ideas of like what should be looked at more closely and what kind of adaptations might be available. And then this study, the whole vulnerability assessment, should set us up to do an adaptation action plan where we really dig a lot more into specific projects that could address some of those vulnerabilities and reduce the risk to those facilities. So when we looked at the sensitivity, we're still working on this list of prioritized critical assets, and we'll incorporate some of the feedback that maybe we get from this meeting into that list. But as it stands now, this is the list of things that we think deserve another look, that they're sensitive to flooding. 21 of them are lift stations. And lift stations are, mostly waterproofed, but they can be issues if they're totally inundated. Water can get into them. The electronics sometimes can be affected and so forth. Healthcare facilities, most of those are private. I believe they're like a bunch of nursing homes and things like that, but certainly, critical infrastructure that we need to think about. Fire stations, it sounds like most of the fire stations are, or at least many of them are newer and are built to Cat 5 hurricane standards, and so they're probably not going to be a big concern, but there are a few that are older. The public safety complex we talked about is one parcel that is somewhat vulnerable to flooding, but I think the city's aware of that and planning for that. We have some schools and other local government buildings. One of them is City Hall and wastewater treatment facility. Any questions before I move on to adaptation action areas? So one of the things we want to do as part of this study is designate adaptation action areas. And adaptation action areas are kind of something the state came up with, that cities can designate these areas, and it helps them receive funding in some cases to do projects in those areas, and it's also a way for the city to adjust their zoning and regulations and so forth to reduce the risk and the vulnerability. So we came up with a few options, 4 options. These, we're certainly open to feedback about these. There's a map out in the lobby that you can put Post-it notes on and give us your comments. They don't have to look like this, and we're open to discussion about what they should look like and which one is the best one, and maybe it's not one that's up there, maybe it's something else that we haven't thought of yet. But option 1 includes 12 neighborhoods that are exposed to flooding under the 2070 intermediate high option. Option 2 is 16 neighborhoods, and that's looking more at that storm surge scenario and what that would do. Option 3 is the same as option 2, but we excluded Andrews Industrial because that parcel is maybe regulated a little bit differently than the residential areas, or has different considerations around it. And option 4 includes, so the first ones are based on the neighborhood boundaries, and then option 4 is based on the city commission district boundaries, so it's all of districts 1 and 3. So you'll notice, if you think back to that storm surge scenario, it's kind of an L shape, the way it impacts the city, like a backwards L impacting the east and the southern part of the city, and the adaptation action areas are designed to sort of mirror that shape. Does anyone have any comments on these?
Question.
Yeah.
What's considered flooding for this study? And I'm asking that, it seems obvious, but I'm asking because you mentioned flooding in the scenarios a couple of times, and I'm looking at the options here. Are we talking 2 feet, 1 feet, 3 feet? Are we talking a distance covering 50% of a neighborhood? What are we really talking about? Because the last time it rained last month, my neighborhood, I live on the 10th floor, but I could see a lake where I live. I'm like, this place is flooded. But I don't see that kind of flooding represented here, so I'm just kind of curious. You're talking footage, you're talking percentage of neighborhood, what is it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So if you go into the flood maps, into the online map that I was showing you,
Mhm.
you can actually click on a spot in the map for the different scenarios and see how deep we predicted the water would be under that. Now, of course, this is just a model, and it doesn't include everything that can happen in a storm. You know, there's wave action, there's all kinds of stuff. Some of the scenarios, like the storm surge scenario, had up to, I think, 19 feet of flooding in some places. Now, those might be like areas that are right by a canal or something. But, you know, it was significant. But for the purposes of our exposure analysis, we were looking at the city's critical assets. If they were just touched by flooding, we took a closer look at them. And then with the sensitivity analysis, we were trying to get like elevation certificates for the building and so forth to see, you know, the amount of flooding that we predicted on that parcel, would it actually impact that asset? So, you know, obviously if your building is elevated, maybe it's not a big problem, but then of course you also have to think about access to the assets. If you have a fire station and it's high and dry, but it's surrounded by water, it's still a problem if you can't get in and out. So it's pretty nuanced, and I think this, again, is kind of a first look, assessing the vulnerability, that then when we really get into figuring out which of these assets we need to really work on, we can look a lot more closely at a site level. You know,
But
some,
you may not also tell them that your map shows different shades of blue and they have different depths, but it's a wide range, like 0 to 1. I mean, that's a
yeah.
lot of a range.
Mm.
So you'd have to look at the color blue to see the depth that that model's predicting. And then the neighborhood map shows the percentage. All that lovely green, you still got 20% of that area flooded.
Right.
On your,
Yeah, yeah.
so it's kind of misleading, like, oh, we're
See, that's-
fine,
okay.
we're green. No, 20% of that area is a lot. 40% of the next light green, that's a lot. 40%?
Yeah.
So you don't want to just read the low, oh, green, good, yay. 20%,
It's still flooded, yeah.
40%,
Well, it's up,
60%.
it's up. Yeah. Right.
So Palm Air is yellow. You got 60% of that could be flooded.
Sure.
So even though you think, oh, yellow, that's only like halfway to red. No, 60%, and then you look at your flood maps to see what your projected depths are. Like the littlest bit is almost white. And then as soon as you get a little bit light blue, you could be up to a foot deep.
And I think we have the online map out in the lobby.
We have the interactive in our little room, so we can look up for
I will be checking it out.
So we can look at that a little more closely. So we're really almost at the end. Whoops, I went the wrong way. I'm really interested if anyone has any feedback on these adaptation action areas.
My only comment is option 4 should be eliminated because the flooding doesn't really care about political districts.
Yeah, okay. That's good feedback. Anybody else?
We'll also appreciate if it's recorded on the board.
Right. Okay. So our next steps in finalizing this study, we're going to take whatever feedback we get tonight, and we're going to come up with our final adaptation action area recommendation. We're going to finalize that list of critical assets. We're going to do a few more polishing touches on the online map and finalize that. And we're going to develop some initial adaptation recommendations. And we have a vulnerability assessment report that we're working on that will sort of summarize all this information. And then there'll be a final city commission meeting where we'll have another presentation about the results of the study. Max, do we have a date for that yet?
No.
So just keep your eye out for that. And then again, you know, this is the first look at the vulnerability, and then will set us up to
pursue grant funding for an adaptation action plan to actually do something about this problem for the affected assets. And then that will translate into projects, which hopefully the city will be able to get lots of funding for. Any other questions? Thoughts?
Thank you, Nate. So as we said, we do have some boards in the lobby which demonstrate the scenarios that were covered in the presentation. We also have computers set up which have the online map available if you're curious about any particular area or property or address and how any of the scenarios might affect that. We're happy to discuss that with you and show you how the map works. As I said, that will ultimately be available publicly, but in the meantime, we're still refining it, and so we'd like to have a bit of control on that for now. So please stop by. It's in the side room over here. And yeah, I think that concludes the presentation. So thank you so much. And we'll be taking more feedback in the lobby.
There's more people.